It was just another quiet morning in the city. The sun was rising slowly, casting a soft, golden light across the streets. People were going about their usual business, walking to work, sipping coffee, getting ready for their daily routines. Among them was Ethan Harris. He wasn't in a rush like the others, but he walked with purpose, his steps steady and calm. Ethan was a man who often went unnoticed by the world around him. He had the kind of face that people forgot the moment they looked away. His hair was short and neatly combed, his clothes plain but clean. He had a gentle smile that made people feel comfortable, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes that few ever saw. Today was like every other day, or so it seemed. He stepped into the store, the small shop he had built from the ground up. It wasn't the largest or the fanciest store in town, but it was his. Ethan had worked long hours, sacrificed much, and poured his heart into making it a success. This was his dream, the place where he had put his blood, sweat, and tears. To the casual observer, he looked like just another customer. Someone passing through, perhaps doing a little shopping. But Ethan wasn't just any man walking into the store, he was the man who owned it. He had worked so hard to get here, and yet, no one ever seemed to notice him as the owner. People walked past him, not recognizing who he was. They greeted him like any other person, sometimes even ignoring him completely. His employees, though polite, treated him like he was just another part of the furniture. They never asked for his opinion, never took the time to really get to know him. To them, he was invisible, nothing more than a figurehead who signed the checks. Ethan wasn't bothered by it at first. He had learned to accept that the world often overlooked quiet people like him. He had built his business not for fame or recognition, but because he believed in it. The satisfaction of knowing he had created something from scratch was enough. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But deep down, Ethan knew there was something missing. He knew that the respect he deserved, the recognition for all his hard work, had never come. People treated him like he was just another person in the background, never realizing the weight he carried on his shoulders. Today, however, would be different. As Ethan entered the store, he took a moment to look around. The shelves were stocked with the usual goods, the air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery in the back, and the hum of the lights above filled the room. Everything looked just as it always did. But something felt off. There was a strange tension in the air, like a storm was brewing, though no one else seemed to notice. Ethan paused for a moment, glancing at the employees behind the counter. Greg Parker, his store manager, was busy talking to a customer, his back turned. Greg had worked for Ethan for years, and although they had never been close, Ethan had always trusted him to run the day-to-day operations. But recently, there had been small signs that something wasn't quite right. Greg had become distant, his attitude colder. He was always polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Ethan uneasy. He had noticed it for a while now, subtle things. A sneer here, a condescending tone there. But Ethan had pushed it aside, telling himself that maybe it was just stress, or perhaps he was overthinking things. Still, today felt different. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Today was going to change everything. As he walked to the back office, he noticed the staff giving him quick glances, their eyes avoiding his. A few of them whispered, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. Ethan didn't mind. He didn't expect them to acknowledge him. He wasn't their friend. He wasn't their equal in their eyes. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Ethan had spent years building something that was his. He wasn't just the quiet guy in the background. He wasn't just the one who signed the checks. He was the one who had made this place possible. And deep inside, Ethan knew it was time for people to start seeing him for who he really was. As Ethan passed by the aisles, his mind raced. His thoughts were sharp, focused. He thought about how much work it had taken to get here. He thought about the long nights, the stress, the sleepless hours spent figuring out how to keep the store afloat when times were tough. Ethan had always been a fighter, even if no one saw it. But fighting for respect was different from fighting to survive. And today, that fight was about to begin. Ethan reached the back office, where his personal desk sat in the corner. He closed the door behind him, locking it quietly. As he sat down in his chair, his fingers brushed the edge of the desk, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingertips. He had built everything in this room: his store, his empire. And yet, it felt like it had never truly been his. Ethan stared out the window, watching the people pass by on the street. He saw them rushing to work, to meetings, to their busy lives. He saw the world moving forward, while he remained in the shadows, unseen and unnoticed. He was tired of it. Today, he would stop being invisible. Today, he would show the world who he was. But how? That was the question. How could he make them see him? How could he make them understand what he had built with his own two hands? Ethan sat at his desk for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the office wrapping around him like a thick fog. His mind was racing, filled with a swirl of thoughts, each one more urgent than the last. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The tension between him and Greg had been building for a while now. It wasn't just the coldness Greg had begun to show, it was the way things were starting to slip through the cracks. Ethan had noticed that sales had been dropping slowly over the past few months. Some of the regular customers had stopped coming, and others had begun complaining about the quality of service. Ethan wasn't blind. He saw the signs. But what bothered him the most wasn't the numbers. It wasn't the decrease in sales or the complaints. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. Not his staff. Not Greg. No one. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above him was the only sound in the room. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't just about the sales. It wasn't just about Greg's attitude. It was about respect or, more specifically, the lack of it. He had built this store from the ground up. He had spent countless hours working, learning, failing, and succeeding. He had invested everything into this business. And yet, here he was sitting in his own office, feeling like a stranger in his own company. Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, staring down at the paperwork scattered across his desk. Invoices, reports, receipts, all the numbers that defined his life. He had poured everything into making this store successful, but what good was success if no one saw it? No one truly saw him for who he was. They only saw the quiet, invisible man who signed the checks. Ethan's mind drifted back to the early days. When he first opened the store, everything had been so full of promise. He had worked day and night, building relationships with suppliers, customers, and employees. At first, it was just him, doing everything, stocking shelves, managing accounts, greeting customers. Over time, as the business grew, he hired more staff. But with every new hire, with every new face in the store, it felt like he lost a little more of the connection he once had with the business. At first, it had been exciting seeing his business grow, feeling the rush of success. But as time went on, things started to change. Ethan became less of a part of the daily operations. He delegated more, trusted others to handle the day-to-day tasks. Slowly, his presence in the store became less important. People began to forget who he was. Greg Parker, the store manager, was one of the first employees he had hired. Greg had been with the business for years, and at first, Ethan had thought he was a good fit. Greg was confident, outgoing, and seemed to know how to handle people. But over time, that confidence turned into arrogance. Greg started to see himself as more important than he really was. At first, Ethan had ignored it. He didn't want to make waves. After all, Greg had been with him from the beginning. He had helped build the store into what it was. But as time passed, Greg's attitude only grew worse. He began to take credit for things that Ethan had done. He started acting like the store was his, and Ethan was just a figurehead. Ethan had tried to ignore it at first. He told himself it was nothing. That Greg was just under pressure, that things would get better. But they never did. And now, it seemed like Greg had finally crossed a line. Ethan could feel it in the air, the tension, the unease. He knew something was about to happen, something that would force him to confront what had been brewing for so long. The door to his office opened with a soft creak, breaking Ethan from his thoughts. He turned to see Greg standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, a smug smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You're looking a little tense, Ethan," Greg said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply stared at Greg, sizing him up. Greg had always been confident, too confident, maybe. But today, there was something different in the air. There was an arrogance in his stance, a sense of superiority that made Ethan's skin crawl. Greg stepped into the office and shut the door behind him, leaning against the wall with his arms still crossed. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice casual, almost bored. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately. But I'm not sure what you're actually doing anymore. You know, just sitting in this office, signing papers, pretending to be busy." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know where this was going, but he could already feel the shift. He could feel the challenge in Greg's words, the sharp edge beneath the surface. "I've been running things around here," Greg continued, his eyes narrowing. "And it's been going just fine. Maybe you should just step back a little. Let me handle things." The words hung in the air like a challenge, each one sharper than the last. Ethan's mind raced. He had known something was coming, but hearing it said aloud was different. Greg wasn't just undermining him, he was actively trying to take over. But Ethan wasn't going to let this slide. Not anymore. He took a deep breath, standing up slowly from his desk. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "Greg," he said quietly, "you don't understand." Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Understand what?" "This store," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years of hard work. "It's mine. It always has been. You might think you've been running things, but this business wouldn't be here without me. And you wouldn't be here without me." For a moment, there was silence. Greg stared at Ethan, his smile fading as he realized Ethan wasn't backing down. "You don't know what you're messing with," Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength. "I built this store from nothing. I've been through more than you can imagine to get here. And I'm not going to let anyone take it from me, not you, not anyone." Greg seemed to hesitate for a moment, his bravado slipping. But then he sneered, pushing himself off the wall. "You think you're in control, huh? You're just the guy who writes the checks. You're nothing but a figurehead. No one here respects you, Ethan. They all know it." That was the moment. Ethan felt a rush of anger flood through him. For so long, he had been invisible. For so long, he had let people push him aside. But no more. This was his business, his dream, and no one, especially not Greg, was going to take it from him. He took another deep breath, his voice calm but full of authority. "I've had enough, Greg. I'm not just some guy you can push around. I'm the one who owns this store, and I'm the one who decides what happens here." Greg took a step back, but his cocky smile returned, though it was tinged with uncertainty now. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice cold. "You think you can just waltz in here and take control? You don't have it in you." Ethan walked slowly toward the door, his gaze never leaving Greg's. You're about to find out just how much I have in me. Ethan had always been the kind of man who preferred to stay in the background. He wasn't the type to boast about his achievements or draw attention to himself. He believed in letting his work speak for itself. In his store, Ethan was the quiet force behind the scenes, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Customers came and went, employees did their jobs, and the day passed in a steady rhythm. Ethan was content with this. As long as his business thrived, he didn't need to be the center of attention. But there was one person who didn't share his philosophy: Greg Parker, the store manager. Greg was loud, brash, and carried himself with an attitude that left no room for subtlety. He made sure everyone knew exactly what he thought of himself and others. From the moment Greg had started working at the store, Ethan had noticed the difference in their approach to leadership. Greg was the kind of person who craved attention, who sought out praise, and who wasn't shy about letting everyone know he was in charge. At first, Ethan had hoped it was just part of Greg's personality. After all, Greg had experience, and Ethan didn't mind letting him take the lead. He wasn't one to micromanage or hover over people. But over time, Greg's attitude started to wear on him. It wasn't just his loud voice or his constant need to be noticed, it was the subtle little things that Greg did to undermine Ethan's authority. Ethan didn't make a big deal out of it at first. He didn't want to seem weak or petty. But as Greg's behavior grew more brazen, it became harder for Ethan to ignore. It started with small comments. Greg would make snide remarks about Ethan's decisions or subtly question his choices in front of others. These remarks were just below the surface, not enough to openly challenge Ethan's authority, but enough to make Ethan feel uncomfortable. "Are you sure that's the best idea, Ethan?" Greg would ask, his tone just a little too sweet. "Maybe we should try something else. I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I know what works." Ethan would smile politely and nod, choosing to brush it off. But inside, it stung. He was the owner of the store, not Greg. Yet, somehow, it felt like Greg had started to take control without anyone noticing. Over time, the subtle comments turned into more open challenges. Greg's voice grew louder, his words more pointed. Ethan could feel it in the way Greg spoke to him, in the way his employees looked at him as if they didn't believe he was in charge. At one staff meeting, Greg made a joke about Ethan's leadership. "Maybe Ethan should take a vacation," he had said with a smirk. "Let the rest of us run the store for a while. I'm sure it'll be fine." The room had filled with uneasy laughter, but Ethan felt the sting of those words. It wasn't just a joke, it was a challenge. A challenge to his authority, his place in the store he had built from nothing. Ethan could feel the eyes of the employees on him, watching to see how he would respond. But he said nothing. He simply smiled, nodded, and carried on. That was his way: keep calm, keep quiet, and let people think what they wanted. But as the days passed, the tension between Ethan and Greg grew thicker. It was like a weight in the air, something that couldn't be ignored. Ethan would walk into the store and immediately feel the shift in energy. Greg would be at the counter, talking too loudly, laughing too hard, making sure everyone noticed him. And Ethan? He would slip into the background, quietly checking on things, making sure the customers were happy, and ensuring that everything was in order. He didn't mind it. He never minded the quiet work that needed to be done. But it bothered him that Greg's presence seemed to overshadow his own. It bothered him that no one ever looked to him for guidance anymore. Instead, they all turned to Greg. The tipping point came one morning when Ethan walked into the store to find Greg standing at the front, holding a meeting with the staff. Ethan hadn't called for a meeting, and he certainly hadn't asked Greg to gather everyone together. But there Greg was, holding court as if he were the boss. Ethan stood by the door, watching silently. Greg was animated, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. His voice was loud enough that Ethan could hear every word. "All right, everyone, Greg was saying, "I know things have been a little slow lately, but we've got this. I'm putting in a new system, and I'm going to make sure this place runs like a well-oiled machine." The employees nodded, some of them smiling and clapping. They seemed to hang on every word Greg said, as if he were some kind of authority figure. Ethan's stomach twisted as he stood there, listening to Greg's plans, listening to him make decisions about the future of the store, decisions Ethan hadn't been consulted on. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping into the room, and all eyes turned to him. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Greg stopped mid-sentence, and the room seemed to shrink. Ethan wasn't one for confrontation, but he couldn't let this go on any longer. "Greg," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Greg gave him a surprised look, but quickly recovered. "Oh, Ethan. We were just going over some new ideas for the store. You know, trying to make things better. I thought I'd take the initiative." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I appreciate your initiative, Greg," he said, his tone cool. "But I think it's important that we all stay on the same page. This is my store. I'm the one who makes the decisions around here." There was a long pause. Greg's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. Of course," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't mean to step on any toes. But the damage had been done. The seed of tension had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. The respect Ethan had once commanded was slipping through his fingers, and Greg was making it clear that he wasn't interested in sharing control. Ethan could feel the weight of Greg's disdain, the way he treated Ethan like a figurehead. That was when Ethan realized that things had gone too far. The store that he had worked so hard to build, the place that had once been a symbol of his success, was slowly being taken away from him. And all because Greg had decided he wanted more. As the days went on, Ethan began to notice more signs of disrespect. Greg would make jokes about Ethan's decisions, undermining his authority in front of the staff. He would take credit for things Ethan had done, as if he were the one who had made the store successful. And the worst part? Ethan had nobody to turn to. The employees had all been with Greg for a long time. They respected him, even though Ethan knew they shouldn't. They saw him as the leader now, not Ethan. The respect that Ethan had worked so hard to earn had all but disappeared. It became clear to Ethan that Greg wasn't just a manager. He was a threat, a man who would stop at nothing to take control of what was rightfully Ethan's. And if Ethan didn't act soon, he might lose everything he had worked for. The days passed in a blur, each one flowing into the next without much change. But Ethan wasn't just letting them slip by. No, he was watching closely. Every single moment, every small action, was carefully etched in his mind. He had learned, over the years, to pay attention to details. And now, those details were stacking up. Greg's behavior wasn't just annoying, it was becoming dangerous. Ethan had always been patient. He knew that sometimes, in business and in life, you had to wait for the right moment. You couldn't rush things. But what Greg was doing, every rude comment, every dismissive glance, every time he undermined Ethan's authority, it was getting harder to ignore. Ethan felt the weight of it more each day. And yet, he stayed quiet. Why? Because he knew that Greg thought he was untouchable. Greg believed that no one would ever challenge him. He was too loud, too brash, too bold to ever face consequences. But Ethan wasn't just another businessman. He wasn't someone who could be pushed around so easily. He wasn't going to let Greg walk all over him without a fight. Ethan had a plan. But that plan wasn't going to come out in the open just yet. Ethan was biding his time, watching, waiting, learning. He had learned that sometimes, patience was the key to victory. And though the tension was thick and the situation seemed impossible, Ethan knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let Greg win. For days, Ethan watched as Greg's behavior escalated. It wasn't just about the rude comments anymore. It wasn't just about Greg's attempts to belittle him. No, this was something deeper, something more dangerous. Ethan noticed the small things. Inventory, once kept in perfect order, was now constantly misplaced. Items were missing, and the shelves were a mess. Some of the more expensive products were out of stock, while cheaper alternatives were pushed to the front of the store. Customers had begun to complain about the service as well. More than one person had left the store frustrated, shaking their heads. They were turning away in search of better service elsewhere. Ethan had seen it all. The subtle signs that something wasn't right. He knew that this wasn't random. It wasn't just coincidence. Someone was deliberately trying to cause trouble. And Ethan was sure of one thing: Greg was behind it. Ethan wasn't the type of person to jump to conclusions. He liked to be sure of things before acting. But the pattern was clear. Greg had been making mistakes, and those mistakes were too perfect, too well-timed, to be accidental. It was sabotage. Ethan's business, his pride and joy, was being destroyed piece by piece, and Greg was the one doing it. But the question remained, how? How was Greg pulling this off? Was he working with someone else? Was he alone in this? Ethan's mind raced. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. But the situation wasn't going to give him any easy solutions. Greg wasn't dumb. He was careful. He knew how to play the game, how to make sure he left no traces behind. Ethan couldn't just walk into the store one day and confront him. That would be too obvious. No, Ethan had to be smart. He had to be strategic. So, he began watching more closely. Every small detail, every action, every word from Greg was now under his scrutiny. Ethan didn't speak up in meetings anymore. He didn't challenge Greg's decisions right away. Instead, he observed. And what he saw made his blood boil. There was something else. Something bigger than just the small mismanagement of the store. Ethan began to notice how Greg was interacting with the staff. Greg wasn't just pushing Ethan's buttons, he was manipulating the entire team. He was using them, slowly turning them against Ethan, planting seeds of doubt in their minds. Ethan had built this store from the ground up. He knew every single person on his team. They were like family to him. But now, Greg was sowing distrust, making the employees question Ethan's leadership. Every time a decision was made, Greg was there, whispering in the ears of the employees, telling them that Ethan didn't know what he was doing. Greg was making them believe that he, and not Ethan, was the true leader of the store. And worst of all, some of them were starting to believe it. Ethan could see it in their eyes. The respect they once had for him was fading. The smiles they used to greet him with were turning into awkward nods. Greg was winning. But Ethan wasn't about to let it end like this. There was a moment, one small moment, that changed everything. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else would have noticed. Ethan had been walking through the store, checking the shelves, when he overheard a conversation between two employees. They were talking about Greg. And what they said made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "He's been saying he's gonna take over," one of the employees whispered. The other laughed nervously. "No way. Ethan built this place. He's not going anywhere." But the first employee wasn't so sure. "Greg says he's just waiting for the right time. He's got some ideas that will take the store to the next level. Ethan doesn't see it. But we do." Ethan's blood ran cold. This was it. Greg wasn't just trying to take over his authority, he was plotting to take over everything. He was positioning himself as the leader, the one who would drive the store to success. Ethan. He was just a shadow in his own business. But Ethan wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. No, he was ready now. He had seen enough. He had all the evidence he needed. He wasn't going to let Greg destroy everything he had worked for. But what would he do? What could he do? Ethan had to make his move, but he needed to be careful. Greg was powerful now. He had the trust of the employees, and he had Ethan's reputation on the line. Ethan didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to stir up trouble that would only make things worse. But he also knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the business, the employees, and everything he had worked for. So, Ethan made a decision. It was time to take action. It was time to show Greg that he wasn't going to be pushed around. But how would he do it? How would he make his move? Ethan wasn't sure yet. But one thing was for certain: he was going to fight back. And this time, Greg wasn't going to win. It was a crisp afternoon when everything changed. The wind outside howled against the windows, signaling the shift of seasons. Inside the store, the atmosphere was dense, filled with the typical bustle of the business. But today was different. Today, Ethan Harris wasn't walking in as the quiet, unassuming owner. He wasn't the background figure who let things slide. No, today, he walked in as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, ready to face the man who had made his life miserable. Ethan's footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing in the silent air of the store. His usual attire, simple and humble, was replaced by a well-fitted suit, his posture taller and more commanding. The same man, but a different presence. He was no longer the Ethan everyone ignored. Now, he was the force they had all underestimated. As Ethan stepped further into the store, he felt a sense of calm confidence. He wasn't nervous. He had spent months waiting for this moment, preparing for it. He had all the evidence, all the paperwork. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the moment when the truth would come out, when everything would finally make sense. Greg Parker, his manager, was behind the counter as usual, acting like he owned the place. He looked up when Ethan walked through the door. The moment Greg saw Ethan's changed appearance, he raised an eyebrow, his expression somewhere between confusion and amusement. "You're back again." Greg sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Still pretending to be in charge?" Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he walked right past Greg, his eyes focused on the back office. Without missing a beat, Ethan pushed open the door and entered the office, leaving Greg standing there, stunned and uncertain. The door shut behind him with a loud slam, almost as if punctuating the moment. For a second, Greg was left in a silence that felt strange. His confident stance began to waver, and the atmosphere seemed to change. Something was happening, something he didn't understand. He was still trying to process the situation when, moments later, one of the employees emerged from the back office and walked straight up to him. "Greg," the employee said nervously, "the boss wants to see you in the conference room." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to make of this sudden turn of events. The tension in the air was palpable. He could feel the weight of something big about to unfold, but he didn't know what. "Fine," Greg muttered, his voice carrying a hint of frustration. He followed the employee to the conference room, still puzzled, trying to piece together what was going on. When Greg entered the room, everything seemed different. The usual chatter of the office was absent, replaced by a cold, almost oppressive silence. Ethan was sitting at the head of the conference table, his posture perfect. The usual Ethan, the man who was always in the background, was gone. In his place was a man with authority, a man who commanded the room with his presence alone. As Greg stood at the door, unsure whether to enter or leave, Ethan looked up. His eyes met Greg's, and for a brief moment, Ethan let the silence hang. The weight of the situation was almost unbearable. This wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. Greg hesitated, then stepped inside, his usual cocky smirk now replaced by a look of confusion. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, trying to maintain his arrogance, but it wasn't as easy as it had been just moments ago. "What's going on here?" Greg asked, his voice unsteady. "What's this all about?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a stack of papers across the table. Greg glanced down at them, but it took him a few moments to fully understand what he was seeing. The papers were official legal documents. He wasn't sure what they meant at first, but as he examined them more closely, his face paled. The documents were ownership papers. The name on the top was unmistakable, Ethan Harris. Greg's heart dropped. His eyes widened, and the blood drained from his face as reality set in. Ethan wasn't just the quiet guy he had been mocking for months. Ethan wasn't just the owner of the store in some vague, behind-the-scenes way. No, Ethan was the true owner, the CEO. The man in front of him was the one who had built this business, who had worked tirelessly to make it what it was. For the first time in what felt like forever, Greg felt vulnerable. His smirk faltered. The facade he had carefully built up, the one where he was the leader of this store, the one where he had secretly pushed Ethan aside, began to crumble. All of it, everything he had believed, was shattering in front of him. Ethan sat back in his chair, calm and collected. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and unyielding. "I think it's time you learned who I really am," he said, his words cutting through the thick silence like a knife. Greg's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had spent so long undermining Ethan, trying to control the store, believing that Ethan was just some figurehead. But now, the truth was clear, Ethan had been in control all along. Ethan wasn't just a quiet owner. He was the boss, the one who had the power, the one who had built this empire from the ground up. The shock on Greg's face was almost palpable. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. All of his arrogance, all of his plans to push Ethan aside, had been for nothing. The man he had been belittling, the man he thought was beneath him, was the one who held all the cards. For a moment, Greg didn't know what to do. His mind was clouded with panic. He had underestimated Ethan, misjudged him at every turn, and now, the consequences were staring him in the face. Ethan didn't need to say anything more. The truth was in front of them, laid out in those ownership papers. There was no denying it now. Greg's world had just turned upside down. As Greg continued to stand there, frozen, Ethan spoke again. His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable strength. "I don't tolerate disrespect, Greg. You've done more than just undermine me. You've tried to destroy everything I've worked for. And that ends today." Greg tried to find his voice, but the words wouldn't come. He had nothing to say. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold realization that he had lost. He had lost everything. Ethan stood up from the table, his presence overwhelming. He looked Greg squarely in the eye. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, but I can't let you continue. You've crossed a line that I can't ignore. You're fired, Greg." The words were final, delivered with a calm authority that left no room for argument. Greg's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He was too stunned to speak. As Greg stood there, paralyzed by the shock of it all, Ethan turned to the door. Without another word, he walked out of the conference room, leaving Greg standing there, defeated. The moment was complete. Ethan had won. The scene inside the store was almost surreal. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of finality. His steps, once careful and measured, were now strong and confident. He had faced his adversary, defeated him, and reclaimed what was rightfully his. But the battle was over, the stakes were clear, and now it was time for the store and its people to change. Greg had been escorted out of the building. The employees had watched as the security team moved in, as Greg's face turned from disbelief to shame. He had been the one who had tried to tear Ethan down, who had mocked his authority, who had pushed him into the shadows. And now, he was being led out like a criminal, his head hung low. It was a dramatic fall from grace for someone who had once believed himself untouchable. As Greg passed by the other employees, there was an uncomfortable silence. No one spoke, but their eyes followed him. Some were curious, some were afraid, and some seemed guilty. Ethan knew that many of them had, at some point, sided with Greg, believing his words, following his lead, and underestimating Ethan. But all of that had changed in the last few minutes. Greg was gone, and with him, the toxic atmosphere that had been poisoning the workplace for so long. The employees who had once whispered behind his back now stood in open awe. It wasn't just the fact that Ethan had fired Greg, it was the way he had done it. The calm authority, the quiet power that had been hidden beneath his humble exterior, was finally on full display. Ethan wasn't just a businessman, he was a force to be reckoned with. And now, the employees had no choice but to reckon with him. They had all underestimated him. They had all thought of him as just another figurehead, just another face in the store. But now, they saw the truth. Ethan was the backbone of the business. He was the reason it had thrived. He was the one who had built it from the ground up. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Ethan stood tall, watching the reactions of his employees. He could feel the weight of their gazes, some filled with respect, others with uncertainty. It was clear that some were still processing what had just happened, still adjusting to the idea of Ethan as the real authority in the store. But as the minutes passed, Ethan saw the change begin to take root. The skeptical looks started to fade. Whispers of admiration began to spread. Ethan's presence was no longer something to be ignored. He wasn't just the man who signed the checks anymore. He was the man who had fought for this business, who had battled through every obstacle to make it succeed. He had faced adversity with quiet resilience, and now, that resilience had paid off. He walked over to the counter where some of the employees were still standing, unsure of what to say. They had seen the spectacle of Greg's exit, but now they were unsure how to approach Ethan. Would they apologize? Would they try to explain themselves? Ethan wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: this was a moment for change. "Everyone," Ethan said, his voice steady and calm, "I want to make one thing clear. This store is built on respect. For me, for you, for all of us. Greg didn't just disrespect me, he disrespected all of us. And we can't allow that to happen anymore." The employees looked at each other, some nodding slowly, some still processing. Ethan continued, "I've always worked hard to make this store a place where we all thrive. But for that to happen, we need to respect each other. No one is above that." The words hung in the air. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about the firing, it was about the shift in culture that needed to happen. This was the moment where things would change. It wouldn't be an instant transformation, but it was the start of something new. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of realization. Ethan had earned the respect of his employees. He hadn't demanded it, he had simply proven that he deserved it. After a few moments, one of the employees, a young woman named Sarah, spoke up. She had been one of the most vocal supporters of Greg during his reign of power. But now, there was a noticeable change in her tone. I think we owe you an apology, Ethan," Sarah said, her voice quiet but sincere. "We didn't understand. We didn't see what you were doing. We thought you were just the guy who signed the checks. But now we see." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "It's okay," he replied. "I've been where you are. I understand what it's like to doubt someone. But all I ask is for respect. We're all in this together." Another employee, Mark, chimed in. "We didn't know, Ethan. We didn't realize what Greg was doing. We just followed along because it seemed easier. But that's no excuse. You deserve better than what we gave you. Ethan nodded, appreciating their honesty. It wasn't easy for them to admit their mistakes, but he could see that they were trying. And that was enough. Change wasn't about perfection, it was about growth. And in this moment, his employees were growing. As the employees began to slowly gather around him, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a new sense of camaraderie. Ethan wasn't just the boss anymore, he was part of the team. They understood now that he wasn't some distant figure, some unreachable authority. He was someone they could respect, someone they could trust. As the day went on, the store returned to its usual rhythm, but everything felt different. The employees moved with a newfound energy, working together in a way they hadn't before. There was a sense of unity in the air, a shared understanding that they were all part of something bigger. And at the heart of it all was Ethan, quiet, calm, and strong. The man who had fought for his place, who had earned their respect, and who had shown them what it meant to truly lead. In the days that followed, Ethan continued to make small but significant changes. He began to engage more with his employees, making an effort to get to know them better. He listened to their ideas, asked for their input, and worked to create a more inclusive and positive environment. The store became a place where everyone felt valued, where respect was not just a word but a practice. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan saw the fruits of his labor. The store thrived. Customer satisfaction soared. The employees, once hesitant and divided, were now united, working together with a sense of purpose and pride. And at the center of it all was Ethan, no longer the quiet man in the background, but a respected leader who had earned everything he had. The tension that had once plagued the store was gone, replaced by a culture of respect and collaboration. Ethan's battle for justice had been hard fought, but it had been worth every step. He had not only reclaimed his place as the true leader of the store, he had built something stronger in the process, a team that was ready to face whatever challenges came next, together. And as for Greg, well, his exit was just the beginning of the store's new chapter. No longer would there be a toxic presence undermining the hard work of others. No longer would there be whispers in the background. The store had been freed from the shadow of someone who never truly understood what it meant to lead with respect. Ethan had proven that the quietest person in the room often has the most to say. He had shown that true leadership isn't about domination or control, it's about respect, trust, and integrity. And in the end, it was that unwavering belief in his own worth, his own values, that had brought him the justice he deserved. The journey had been long, but now, as he stood in his store, watching his employees work with pride and purpose, Ethan knew that it had all been worth it. He had fought for respect and he had won. As Ethan stood quietly, watching his store run smoothly, a sense of calm filled the air. He had won, but there was no need for grand celebrations. He hadn't needed to yell, to argue, or to prove anything through force. Instead, Ethan had simply let time reveal the truth. He had worked hard, kept his integrity intact, and, most importantly, he had remained patient. In the end, Ethan didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight back with anger. He had simply waited for the right moment to let his actions speak louder than words. And in doing so, he had shown everyone around him something profound: power didn't always need to be loud. Strength didn't have to be forceful. And sometimes, the most powerful move was simply standing firm, no matter how many tried to push you down. As the days passed, Ethan watched as his employees learned and grew. They began to understand the lesson he had taught them through his example. It was a lesson not just in business, but in life. True strength didn't come from tearing others down. It didn't come from loud speeches or aggressive moves. True strength came from within, quiet, calm, and unwavering. Ethan had known all along that he wasn't just fighting for control of a business. He was fighting for respect, for fairness, for something deeper. He had built the store from the ground up, and it was never just about making money. It was about creating a place where people could work together, where they could learn from each other, and where they could feel valued. In the midst of the turmoil, Ethan's vision had remained clear. He wasn't going to let anyone destroy that vision. The truth is, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And when others fail to see it, that's when they're most vulnerable. Greg had failed to recognize Ethan's quiet strength. He had believed that being loud and brash was the way to win, that power came from pushing others down. But in the end, it was Ethan who stood victorious because he understood something that Greg never would. True leadership comes from respect, from patience, and from believing in yourself, even when others don't. As Ethan reflected on all that had happened, he thought about the people he had met along the way. He thought about the employees who had doubted him, who had looked past him, and who had underestimated his ability to lead. But most of all, he thought about how much they had changed. They had seen his quiet strength, his commitment to doing what was right, and they had learned from it. They had learned that respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it was something that had to be earned. And the best way to earn it wasn't through force or manipulation. It was through action. Ethan's story wasn't just a tale of a man who reclaimed his business. It was a story of a man who had taken a stand for himself and for the people around him. He had shown that even in the face of adversity, even when others tried to diminish him, it was possible to rise above it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. But Ethan had proven that with patience, perseverance, and a belief in his own worth, anything was possible. Now, as he walked through the store, greeting customers and employees alike, he could feel the shift in the air. There was no tension anymore. There were no whispers of doubt or discontent. There was a new sense of unity. The store had become a place where everyone respected each other. It had become a place where the employees worked together, supported each other, and took pride in what they did. And that was what Ethan had fought for. As the months went on, the store continued to thrive. The business grew, customers were happier, and the employees were more motivated than ever. But the true success wasn't measured in profits or sales. The true success was in the culture that had been created. A culture of respect, of collaboration, and of hard work. A culture that reflected Ethan's values, a culture where quiet strength was celebrated, not ignored. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply stay true to yourself. Ethan had never wavered from his values, even when it would have been easy to give in. He hadn't let the pressure of others change who he was. And because of that, he had achieved something far more lasting than any quick victory or fleeting success. He had built a business and a team that could endure, because it was built on the foundation of respect and trust. As Ethan looked back on everything he had been through, he realized that the journey wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had been with him along the way, the employees who had grown, the customers who had supported him, and even the challenges he had faced. Every part of the journey had shaped him, had strengthened him, and had taught him something valuable. Ethan didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had already shown who he was, and more importantly, he had shown others what it meant to lead with integrity and respect. And that was something that no one could take away from him. At the end of the day, Ethan's story wasn't about the victory itself, it was about how he had earned it. It was about how he had stayed true to his principles, how he had kept his focus, and how he had shown others the power of quiet leadership. As the sun set on another day, Ethan stood in front of his store, looking at the world around him. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he also knew that he was ready for them. He had learned that the quietest person in the room often has the most power. And as long as he remained true to himself, no one would ever be able to take that away. Ethan had learned a powerful lesson, and now it was his turn to pass it on. Sometimes, the best way to lead is by example. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is be patient, stay calm, and wait for the right moment. Because when the time comes, your actions will speak louder than anything you could say. And that's when the world will finally understand who you really are. As the store doors closed for the night and the lights dimmed, Ethan walked away with a quiet smile. He had earned his place. He had fought for it. And now, he was ready for whatever came next because he knew that no matter what, his quiet strength would always be enough.